You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on August 6th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, is it working?
Yep.
Yeah. What's up? I'm Damon. Hello. Good to be here. So I once heard this preacher say the brilliance of Jesus' teaching to love your enemies is that if you love your enemies, then you no longer have enemies. Which sounds cool, but I feel like it's a very narrow understanding of enemies, more based on just the people you persecute and not the people who are persecuting you. Because it's one thing to tell like an ICE agent to love your enemies. It's another to tell an undocumented immigrant to love your enemy. And so I think when we choose to become a loving community, to stop persecuting, to stop hating, stop participating in violence, there still ends up being a question of enemies. And I want to widen this conversation a bit to talk about valid enemies and how we define enemies. And so first, I want to tell a story. I came out with a book called The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus in 2022. And the people who liked it told me that they liked how it resonated with them because they always thought Jesus was more radical than what their church taught them. And so I ended up getting this email from someone saying that they're doing a book club through my book, and they wanted me to join for one of the meetings through a video call. And they said, I know this is a long shot, but I actually like being able to be a part of those types of meetings and hear what other people think about the book. But then came the part of the email that showed why they thought it was a long shot. They said, by the way, we're members of the Satanic Temple in San Diego. And I jolted up and was like eyes wide, really reading this email. Like, I didn't even think I was on the radar of any Satanists. And then, yeah, it was wild. And then in parentheses, they wrote, don't worry, we're just spicy atheists. And it was funny because I could tell that they were like, yeah, it's interesting. I could tell they were trying hard to not scare me away. But the truth is, most Satanists are just spicy atheists, and especially the Satanic Temple, which was an organization started to fight for real religious freedom and against Christian authoritarians who say they're fighting for religious freedom, but usually you see a lot of Christian favoritism among certain Christian politicians. And so they use the symbol of Satan as a symbol of rebellion against Christian authoritarians, essentially saying, if you guys are the hero of this story, we'll gladly be your villain. And so it's an interesting group. And I said yes. And so I visited this Zoom call, and it was 2 people, and then they said, yeah, we have this thing called Satan time. I was like, what's Satan time? It sounds scary. And then they laughed and said, Satanists are rarely ever on time. And so then a few more people came in. And then they ended up being some of the kindest, most thoughtful people I've ever met. And they liked how I was talking about Jesus as someone who resisted oppression. And it resonated with their own desire to resist oppression and fight for real freedom for everyone. And we talked about our common values and the world we wanted to see of real freedom for everyone without any religion imposing their values on other people. And I realized these people aren't my enemy. And yet, growing up in an evangelical church, I was taught that these are the ultimate enemies that I need to be scared of. And I realized we actually have a common enemy, which is systems of oppression. And that's the valid enemy, systems of oppression. And so let me break down what I mean by that. By oppression, first of all, I mean acts of violence, exploitation, discrimination, imposed by a group in power in order to maintain their power by suppressing other people's power. And so a system of oppression includes policies, government regulations, healthcare, banking, law enforcement, policing, housing, labor laws, workplace, corporate structures, religious institutions, and cultural norms, all designed together to suppress other people's power. And so that's the valid enemy I'm talking about, the systems of oppression. And what's interesting is that the development of the idea of Satan was actually initially meant to critique systems of oppression. Like in the Old Testament, you see the word Satan briefly mentioned as a role. The word initially meant to block or obstruct someone's path, to get in the way of someone's path. And a few angels took that role in the Old Testament, but it wasn't like an actual enemy of God. And then between the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jewish teachers started to look around and see that there is a system of oppression that maintains its power across all these human enemies. There's a system of oppression from ruler to ruler, empire to empire, the same land being fought for, the same resources being extracted, the same people groups being enslaved. And so it started to seem as if there's a larger spiritual enemy in charge of these empires, no matter who was in charge. And so this became a symbol for empire. And it's possible that when these religious teachers were talking about a Satan figure, individual being, it's possible it was all symbolic. It's also possible it started symbolic and later became more literal. It's also, let's open the possibility that they'd received a genuine revelation into the spiritual realm and found that there really was a being named Satan. Each of you could believe whatever you like about that. But I think the interesting thing is this recognition that there is a larger systemic oppression that remains in control across ever-shifting human enemies, no matter who is in charge. And so early Christianity, they adopted this Satan as a symbol for empire. And they kept that for a while until Christianity became the religion of the empire and in the 300s. And then it switched, and suddenly the people who stood in the way of empire were called satanic. Suddenly Jewish people, pagans, and Christian heretics were called satanic. And in that shift of Christianity becoming an empire religion, God and Satan traded places. God was this figure of change and liberation, and Satan was the figure of preservation of the empire. And then, all of a sudden, God was a symbol for preserving the empire, and Satan for those who wanted to change things. And you see this all throughout Christian history, this reversal. And we could go way deeper into this, Middle Ages, witch trials, the Satanic Panic in the 80s, but we don't have time. But I think you even see it in today's language in the way people talk about God, and they'll say, like, we need to take America back to the way it was when Christians were in control, and get rid of these people who are trying to change things, and call marginalized people and activists satanic. People even call me satanic. Some Christians will get in my YouTube comments online, and I'll make a video about like a more liberative, inclusive Christianity. And some Christians will say I'm possessed by Satan, being led by Satan, leading people to Satan. But I could tell that it's based on a fear of change. And so one time I went to this event called Theology Beer Camp with a bunch of theologians, and I met this famous 90-year-old biblical scholar named John Dominic Crossan. And John Dominic Crossan has been receiving this kind of criticism from Christians since way before I was born. So it was epic meeting him and talking to him. And he asked me about my work a bit and if I received criticism. And I said, yeah, sometimes people call me these things. And I said, sometimes people will even leave the clever comment, more like Damon Garcia. And they think it's clear they think they're the first one to come up with it every time I see it. But he laughed and said, yeah, back in the day they used to call me John Demonic Crossan. And we got to laugh together. And it was interesting because I feel like that moment, I felt like something deep inside of me healed. And I think it's because for the first time I got to tell someone that people call me demonic, and the other person got to respond, me too. And I felt a similar kind of healing when I was in that Satanist book club meeting. And I think what I was experiencing was, first of all, what happens when demonized people come together and realize they're not so scary after all, and that we're not really the enemies after all. And secondly, how silly it is that we're making each other the enemies, making people so scared of us. And thirdly, realizing we have a common enemy, which is systems of oppression. And so I would like us to reclaim that systemic lens of oppression and take it out of the spiritual realm so much and make it more material, physical, material systems of oppression. And so we can use that systemic lens for oppression today, like the mass deportations, for example. Some politicians say that immigrants are the enemy. The immigrants are the ones standing in our way, blocking our path like a Satan as we're trying to build a life and provide for our families and find meaningful work. And they say immigrants are a bunch of criminals and taking our jobs and taking government resources. But if we take a systemic lens and put it on, look at the data, we could discover things like, actually, undocumented immigrants have a lower crime rate than natural-born citizens across the whole country. Also, most undocumented immigrants can't qualify for government programs, but they still have to pay taxes through their jobs. So they're actually contributing to society more than they're taking often. And also, immigrant labor usually creates more productivity, which then creates more jobs. So they're not taking jobs either. And when we make those discoveries, it can make us angry and feel like, well, why are they lying to us? And at this point, we have to make sure we keep the systemic lens on, because we could just revert back to the individualistic lens and say, well, Trump is just evil, or people who support Trump are just evil. But that's too simple. That's too easy. I don't think that's how it actually works. And I think what we see is a lot of people who support the mass deportations are people who are facing economic instability. And a politician like Trump says it's immigrants' fault, and the rest of the politicians aren't really giving much of an answer for the economic stability they're facing, so they just go along with the easy answer. But the economic instability is real. And we have to ask, with our systemic lens, who benefits from us making enemies out of each other? Well, it turns out mass deportations and detention camps are actually an extremely profitable business. The Congress paid the Department of Homeland Security $107.9 billion at the beginning of 2025. And they used that money to collaborate with private businesses to track, arrest, and detain people. 90% of detainees are in private detention camps operated by Geo Group and CoreCivic. And their stocks have skyrocketed over the last decade, and especially over the last year since Trump got elected. Also, ICE paid the data analytics company and military contractor Palantir $30 million in April to build an app called Immigration OS, designed to track and surveil migrants. But the thing is, in order to create an app like that, you have to track everyone in the United States. So I believe there's this power play happening to build a stronger surveillance state to gain more control over all of us. And they do it by convincing us that they're protecting us from dangerous immigrants. And so I think there's larger things at play where people control systems of oppression that we can find actual enemies. And so I don't think it's just Trump. I don't think it's just any politician. Because also Republicans and Democrats have raised funding for DHS every year since it's formed in 2002. So I don't think it's a political party problem either. I don't think it's individual capitalists either. I'm trying to keep a systemic lens and say, well, there are people who take advantage of that system, invest in companies like this, capitalists and politicians, to get richer off the business of mass deportations. And that system, I think, is our actual enemy. And so when we define the enemy from a systemic perspective, we start to see it differently. Like, I don't think the problem with politics today is all the fighting, even though that's what a lot of people say. I think the problem is we don't know what we're fighting against, and we don't know what we're fighting for, really, either. And we're fighting for a lot of things: health, well-being, survival, good community, good relationships, meaningful work. But I think the thing that connects all of the things we're fighting for is that we're all fighting for the power to shape our lives. And so there's times where, well, there's more barriers to the power to shape our lives among different people based on discrimination, based on race and gender and sexual orientation, race, disability, age, religion. And so that difference in barriers can make us feel like each other is the enemy, without realizing, actually, what about the people who are placing the barriers there, who are happy that we're blaming each other for it? And so if we're fighting for the power to shape our lives, I think we could define what we're fighting against is the system that suppresses our power. Because there's so many things that we have little say in that happen to us, like where our tax dollars go, wages, over-policing of our communities, how our goods and services are distributed for everyone, environmental policies. And so there's a lot of ways we can come together and fight for more power to shape our lives. And when it comes to people, I would say from this perspective that I'm sharing, that people are only our enemies because of their position within the system to suppress our power. People like capitalists or anti-democratic politicians or police can make themselves our enemies because of how they relate to the system. But nobody is inherently our enemy, and nobody is permanently our enemy. This may not sound like it, but I'm non-dual like Tim too. I'm with the non-duality. So I would say nobody's really divided like at a deeper spiritual, inherent, natural, organic level. And yet, there's a system that divides us, and people who take advantage of that system, and because of their position, use it to gain more power and to continue to divide us. And so there's always an open invitation for anyone to return to this side of the fight. But I would say there does need to be a fight. And that's what it means to be a loving community. Because we ask, okay, who's actually in our way? It's not immigrants, it's not marginalized people. I wouldn't really say it's any specific individuals or people group or any of that. I would say it's these systems of oppression and people who use the system against us. And we start that fight by coming together and realizing that we actually have a lot more in common than we may think. That we actually are fighting for similar things, the power to shape our lives. And we're all made better people when we can learn from each other and love each other and be in solid communities that care for each other and fight for what we need. And that is what it means to be a loving community that also fights for what they believe in and fights against wrong. And so I just wanted to give you that wider perspective on that subject. And we have can you go to the slide of questions? I want y'all to talk about this subject. And did you hand out pieces of paper? So yeah, we weren't able to get it in the app today, but we have printed papers so you could read it better. And I want y'all to talk about this. And so the first question, right here, self question, is name a personal experience when you realized that people you thought were your enemy weren't your enemy after all. What did you learn? How did that change the way you see the world? And the sacred question is, how has your concept of spiritual evil or moral evil changed throughout your spiritual journey? In your current spiritual perspective, do you have a concept of a spiritual enemy, and how do you define a spiritual enemy? And 3, society. Who are the people that today's political leaders demonize and antagonize? Who benefits when we participate in that demonization, and how do they benefit? Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.